Christina Baker Kline, and this is the second time we're on Substack, but we're on Substack Recording Studio this time instead of Zoom. But
That's true.
she has written a new book in the past, whatever, 2 months. No, but I know you've been working on this for a long time.
Yeah.
The book is called The Foursome, and I had, it's funny because you told me about writing this book in 2021. I remember you came over for dinner and you told me about it, and you were having issues with it. And I know that you then put it aside. And the book is about Chang and Eng and your relatives, your
Yeah.
distant relatives, sisters who married the Siamese twins. Tell me the origin of the book and what were the issues that were going on when you decided that you had to stop writing?
Yeah, I put it aside for 3 years,
Yeah.
basically, which is why it's been 6 years since my last so Chang and Eng, Bunker I am distantly related to the women they married in North Carolina. My mother's entire family is from North Carolina, and my genealogist cousin, don't we all have one, um, who knows everything about our family history, figured this out a long time ago. It was like the early 90s. So I've known this for a really long time. But I never thought about writing about it because there are a lot of complicated issues, for one thing.
Let me ask you one question. So are you a descendant of Chang and Eng, or you're just related to those sisters through marriage?
Related to the sisters through marriage. So distant cousins of the sisters, which the relation is that Chang and Eng married these sisters, and their father is the brother of my line. So
Okay.
we're cousins. My mother called them like her great great aunts or whatever. So I'm just distant cousins, and I do have to say I've been all over the country in the past month, traveling for this book, and I've met like a dozen descendants who are real descendants, who are the great grandchildren of Chang or Eng, and their wives.
It's
It's
kind of,
amazing.
and I have to say, as I was reading it, I kept, I mean, first of all, you think about the piece of skin or the band that is attaching these two brothers from the sternum, right? Is that where it was approximately?
Yeah, so right below the ribs, like a 4-inch piece of cartilage. I did not. So first of all, let's step back for a second, because one thing I have learned on my book tour is that people under 35 don't usually know about Chang and Eng and have never heard of them.
Which
But
is
they used to be. I know it was a whole thing for us, my generation, which was Guinness Book of World Records and Life magazine and even Time magazine, featured them. But nowadays, kids don't really know. So kids meaning 35 years old.
yeah.
So I would just say these guys were world famous, essentially rock stars. They were conjoined, but every set of conjoined twins is number one is identical, which I did not know until I worked on this book, and number two is conjoined in a different way. So Chang and Eng were born in the early 19th century. They became world famous, and I'll talk about why in a minute. But meaning they became world famous because they were two able-bodied men who were conjoined in a particular way that meant they could still be athletes. They were incredibly agile. They did acrobatics, backflips, somersaults. They built houses together. They were able-bodied, but they were two men who could not be separated
Right.
because at the time they were joined. The piece that joined them included part of their liver. So
Right.
anyway, these guys. But the reason really that they were world famous is that, and this was another deep dive of research I did that was so fascinating. Newspapers in the early to mid 20th century there were all these tabloid penny papers, they called them.
Right.
And they would be sent on stagecoach all over the United States into these very small rural communities. So New York City, San Francisco, Baltimore, Philadelphia, all those big papers. And there would be little tabloid papers that would feature, kings, queens. It would be like Brad Pitt. It would be like People magazine. So little rural North Carolina, where the twins ended up, had been reading about them for years before they ever showed up in town. And it was as if kind of royalty had come to town when they got there. So, because people had been reading about them for so long and looking at the line drawings in the papers and all of that. So, it was fascinating to learn what celebrity was like in that time period and how very famous they were at that time.
And especially because there was nothing else going on. Remember, there are no movies, right?
Yeah, yeah,
There's no
yeah,
celebrity was people like Chang and Ang.
yeah.
And I was surprised also to learn I guess I did not know this part of the story that they settled in North Carolina. That was a surprise to me, as was the connection to your family. What I know the reason why they ended up in North Carolina, but tell me from your own words what happened. How did they end up in North Carolina?
Well, really interestingly, these guys had essentially been sold into indentured servitude by their mother. And but they were so brilliant that these were teenage boys. They were put on a ship 4 months to Boston, to where they were gonna start to be displayed by this British merchant. And on that trip, by the way, when they got on the boat, they did not speaking a word of English. When they got off the boat, not only were they fluent in English, they were reading books, they were doing mathematical equations on paper, which they'd never done before, and they were beating everyone at chess, checkers, and cards. They were so incredibly savvy and smart. And then they were displayed around the world by taken advantage of, by people who, rode first were in first class when they rode in steerage,
And essentially
and
owned, right? They were basically owned. They were, in
they were owned.
essence,
They bridled against being called slaves, and this is not in the book, but the Virginia legislature fined their manager because they called him a slave owner who wasn't paying taxes on his slaves.
interesting.
So, this was a whole thing that went to court that was fascinating. Many people said that they were enslaved, but they said that they weren't. They were indentured. They were so, they had a lot of pride. But by the age of 21, they essentially bought their own freedom, and then they started displaying themselves on their own terms. And the way they ended up in North Carolina is that many doctors went to their shows, and I'm saying farmers because 'cause I'm thinking of the farms in
Right.
North Carolina. Many doctors went to their shows, and this guy was a landowner in North Carolina, and he invited them to come hunt and fish on his properties. Doctors went to see them because they were fascinated with their physiognomy, and they wanted to study them, and so anyway, this guy invited them down, and yesterday, I did an event in Tampa with a descendant named Alex Sink, who's very famous in Florida. She ran for governor, and she's a big philanthropist, and she was telling me that she went to Thailand to their village, and I had written this in the book, but I to hear it corroborated firsthand was interesting. It was so similar to Northwestern North Carolina in terms of topography, climate. So they went to this area and they just completely fell in love with it. It was beautifully lush and green, mountainous, lots of lakes and rivers, and also humid in the summer in a similar kind of way.
And
And so
felt like home, basically.
like home, it felt like home, and so they immediately knew, they were like, "We're never leaving." And so they retired to become gentlemen farmers, and they actually kept going back on the road, but they did open a general store and build a fancy house, and all of a sudden set up shop down in
And let's talk about that fancy house for a second, because this is the reason you ended up not writing for 3 years, is you discovered that they owned enslaved people.
They did, and it wasn't at first. In fact, today I'm in Charleston right now in a hotel room. I just gave a talk today where I mean, this is the first time I've really been in the South, this part of the tour, and so it's very different talking about slavery here than it is anywhere else. And one of the things I was talking about is having to resolve for myself the question of how the great irony, of course, 2 people who were essentially enslaved themselves, who were treated terribly, who managed to essentially buy their own freedom, became enslavers. How in the world would that happen? And what I figured out, or what I came to, is that Chang and Ang were nothing if not incredibly ambitious and savvy and determined to survive. And they were so I can't even state the extent to which they were underdogs. They came over essentially enslaved. They had no money, no resources, zero, nothing. And they made and lost a fortune like 3 different
Right.
times. They were determined to succeed. They go to the most racist, conservative place you could ever imagine, not to mention Bible Belt. They were Buddhist. They never converted, even though they built a church on their property for the community. They were so far beyond the pale of anything that would be treated with respect. And yet they became huge people in this community, to the extent that when eventually they lost all their money in the Civil War and their Confederate bonds were worthless and everything, they had to go back on tour with P.T. Barnum, whom they loathed because he treated them terribly, as he treated all his people terribly. They went to California, where they'd been many times, but now it was post-gold rush, and the Asian influx had been extensive. And as always happens in our country, when a lot of immigrants come in of a certain racial background, they're then
Ostracized.
everybody thinks they're gonna take all the jobs, and so they're treated badly. So they got to California with their children on tour, and all of a sudden, there were all these racial slurs, and people were literally throwing fruit and vegetables at them, and they were stunned because they'd spent the past however many years as, like, gentlemen farmers and at the top of the heap in North Carolina,
And
and it
being
was
adored and being loved by their community, yeah.
being loved by their community, and it was such cognitive dissonance for them to be in that position, suddenly at the bottom of the food chain again.
Well, I would like to actually switch tacks for a second and talk about the fictionalized part of this, because I was fascinated. I mean, I have spent, I would say, the past 7 days reading this whenever I can. It's been one of those books, those propulsive books that you can't stop reading. And one of the things I've been finding fascinating is trying to figure out how much of this is Christina Baker Kline getting into the heads of these characters, and how much of this is taken from any biography. And then I read at the end of the book, when I get to the acknowledgments, that there is not a lot of biography of the women, right? It's only Chang and Ang, about which we know so much because there's historical record, but the women, there's little to no historical record. So you had to come up with a story that allowed us, the reader, to understand why two sisters would agree to marry men who are conjoined, to share a bed with men who are conjoined, to have sex. And I have to say, one of the best parts for me was you imagining sex in this situation, because that's what everybody wants to do. Like, how did it happen? What
Yeah.
how did and to me, I actually am like, I'm a little confused, like, were they on their backs? Were they like, how did they sleep? Did they sleep on their stomachs? Like, there's so much that you were able to answer, and the idea of, like, the body flipping over as one of them has sex with the other, like, these are very visceral images. How did you come up with this?
So many questions to answer
I
there,
know,
but
I'm
the
sorry, I
the
threw it all
stretch
at you.
no, but, like, I did a lot of research. There were some really interesting ways that I did research. One is that the biographers have all attempted in their different ways to speculate about what it was like, and they've talked to doctors, biologists, the physics of it, I mean, all of it. So there is kind of a lot written about them in particular. It's speculation, but another okay, let me think of there may be 5 different ways. One is that. Another is that they practiced what they called alternate mastery. And what this meant is that when one was in the home of the other, he was supposed to be entirely passive, seen but not heard, did not express opinions, was not supposed to be, at all meddlesome in what was going on. And that was because they drove each other completely nuts. So they had to come up with this.
Imagine, right? Can you imagine having to be attached to your sister 24/7?
It's impossible to imagine. And as I was saying today, like, it's true that I don't know what it feels like to be conjoined. However, I do know what it's like to have in-laws, as we all do. Like, or, so for the sisters to navigate, the brother is right there, but we all have, and also if you're in any kind of relationship, you know that, like, you drive each other crazy sometimes. It's
Yeah.
just the way it is.
Yeah.
But imagine, like, with his brother also commenting on whatever argument you get into. all of that was fascinating to explore.
Yes.
But back to the sex for a second.
Yeah.
So then another thing, so another really interesting source is there's a BBC documentary, which by the way, no, it's not BBC, it's Channel 4 in England. And I know that because I just looked it up because I was talking about it blithely all the time. And then I was like, I should probably make sure
Right.
that I got the facts right. It came at it, they, Channel 4 with this narrator who was very David Attenborough like, who was like, well, I'll explain in a second. They followed a Mormon sect, polygamous sect, a guy who lived on the hills, still does, I think, the hills of Utah against. So the backdrop is like this sheer rock face. And then he built this sprawling compound. And over the course of the year that they filmed him, he married, I think he took on another two wives. But the narrator would say like, and here we see the polygamous Mormons in their natural habitat. It was not a reality show. It was like a serious documentary that was very granular about sex and everything else and the women's feelings and the jealousies and then the guy and how it all worked. And that was actually super helpful to me. There was a whole Reddit thread about polygamists that was super useful because they were all in on Reddit. But then there are two sets of conjoined twins right now, both female, one in their 20s, one in their 30s, who are so open about their
Really?
sexuality. Yeah, so one set are like kind of famous. They had a reality show. They live in I just was in Minneapolis and people see them all the time walking down the street. One is married, I believe, and the other maybe has a boyfriend. And they're both teachers. They live outside of Minneapolis. Then the other set are Mexican. They're two girls, women in their 20s, and they're so open about their sexuality. And they have a YouTube channel.
Wow.
And so they talk for like an hour at a time about all of this. And one says she's asexual. The other one, I think, just got married, has a boyfriend. So that was super helpful to me as well. And then just, imagination, like, how does this work? What does it feel
Yeah.
like? So the reason just to step back for the readers, my novel is about these two marriages, but it focuses on the sister who was coerced into marriage by
Yeah.
her beautiful, charismatic, uh, charming, sparkly sister who fell in love with the debonair and rascally and sort of sly brother. The two of them had a lot of sparks. And then they had to convince their shy, awkward, plain siblings to fall in love with each other. And I write from the perspective of the plain, shy sister because she was such a great character and her ambivalence about getting married, which is well documented, and her like, what am I doing here? Was, I think, what the reader feels when you're
Totally.
entering.
Yeah, I felt so completely enmeshed with her. Also, I wanna tell you, I my first marriage was to an identical twin, and when you are talking about these issues about the twins, even, they don't have to be conjoined to be each other's
Enmeshed.
enmeshed partner, and I have sisters who are identical twins, and I discovered by being married to an identical twin that I have friends, 2 women who are identical twins, and they also married men who had identical twins in the family because to us, it was not like a freak of nature, it was something we grew up with, but to other people, it is very odd.
Yes.
When my kids were little and their uncle would, like, run in, walk in the door, and they would run up to him and be like, "Daddy," and then he'd sort of be confused, like, that was part of my daily life, and you really I have to say, in this book, you were able to really get to the heart of being married to an identical twin, whether or not they're conjoined or not. You
Yes.
got to something that I felt in my own marriage, and maybe at my marriage's detriment, I was n always gonna be the third wheel, always.
It is such an intimate relationship, even if, as you said, even if you're not conjoined. And I'm really close friends with a set of twins, and we're all now old. And I met them when we were 50, all 15. And they are perhaps more enmeshed than they were when we were 15. And it's just like they are the lifelong bond.
Yeah,
And you know.
Yeah.
And with Chang, I mean, it was just all of it was kind of fascinating to explore how you cannot have a conversation without the other human present. So you're kind of almost in a constant state of irritation or shame because like you can't say anything private. It's
No.
so fraught and
And
hard.
the whole beauty of a love relationship, which I should probably mention that you have given me my current love relationship. You were the one that introduced me. And so I now know what that intimacy is like, which I never had in my marriage, an intimacy that really relies on you and me against the world, you and me alone, you and me sharing secrets, sharing intimacies, sharing these things that these poor women in the foursome could never have. And I felt Sally's frustration or Sarah's frustration. She goes by Sally or Sarah in the book, but I
Yes.
felt her frustration constantly of never being able to say, "Hey, your brother's an asshole."
Well, not only that, but she couldn't even talk about her frustration with her sister to her
Right.
husband because her sister's husband was there. Like,
Right.
so
Right.
all of that was so complicated. But to go back to your earlier question about what's real and what isn't. So Sarah was Sally. I wouldn't have actually chosen to have 2 names
Right.
but, there whenever so you know this, being friends with lots of writers, fiction writers who 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 write about the past or who write about real events, fall along a spectrum, and some people don't care about facts. I mean, some people, like, if the fact doesn't fit the story, they're just gonna abandon the fact. My father was a historian. He was chair of the University of Maine history department for many years, and he was meticulous in his research. He wrote 12 books. And I didn't think I had anything in common with him when I started writing fiction. No one in my family writes fiction. Um, my parents were both professors, but they had no interest in writing fiction. And I have come to realize that I absorbed so many of his habits and sort of research
Yeah.
methods. So I write longhand as he did. For these books, not my thrillers. That's a sort of different thing. But I write longhand. My research is meticulous, and I have never met a fact I don't like. I when there is a fact, I use the fact. If there isn't one, I then have a lot of freedom. But the other thing though, is that as you mentioned, the lives of the women were not that well documented, and I'm writing from the perspective of people who never had a voice. So
Right.
that is all imagination. Of course it is. All of it is. Every single word in the book is imagination. It's just that if I could, like, the um Sally actually had 2 children who she had a number of children who died. Her 4 daughters all died before her, but she had 2 who died really horrifically as infants, and my editor, when I turned in the first draft, was like, "Oh my god, we have to combine these because this is way too much. You cannot have 2 amounts of suffering."
Was the baby falling into the fire a real is
Yeah,
that
that was real,
actually
and then
happened?
there was boiling water was the other one.
Oh my god.
Terrible. So we combined them into one baby, but,
Wow.
so that was a fiction. There's one character in the book, one central character, Aunt Joan, who is a fiction. She did not exist, but
Who's a good
I
character. She's great. She's great.
well, I needed her,
Yeah.
and I am Southern on both sides, and I have an Aunt Joan on both sides. And I think most Southern families have an Aunt Joan who's like, "What the actual fuck?
Right.
This society that I live in, and I am not trucking with it." There usually is somebody living in the woods or just who's checked out who does not agree with the status quo of that world.
Right.
And I needed that because I wanted I here's what happened as I wrote the book that was a shock to me and so hard, and part of the reason I put it aside. I thought at first I was writing this domestic story about 2 women, like, what is it like to be married to conjoined men? That's what I thought I was writing. And instead, it turned out to be this kind of epic about living in slavery, living in domestic proximity to people who have no rights, whom your husband owns. How what a nightmare for everyone that is. I mean, of course, it's a much worse nightmare for the enslaved people, but it's actually such a diseased and horrific nightmare of a situation that everyone pretended wasn't a nightmare. I mean, the ways that you had to delude yourself on both sides to even just live were so mind-boggling, and I had never quite grappled with what that could have felt like at that granular level because, in part, the truth is the men who worked outside of the home weren't in the sphere of this intimacy that women who gave birth with each other and raised their children together for the
And
first 10 years of
and
life
breastfed them, yes.
and breastfed them.
Yeah.
For the first 10 years of life, the children of the enslaved women and the enslavers' wives raised their children together if they were the same age. And then as there's a scene in the novel where
Grace and
Grace really
Sally.
existed and Sally have this there's a they when they it's like a decade, like when they're about 10 or 11, the adults are like, "Okay, that's over. Now we're going back to how it's supposed to be." And it was shocking for everyone. You know,
Yeah,
it's shocking. Your friend is no longer really your friend and has to call you miss and all that.
it is shocking. It's very, very shocking.
All of it is shocking. And so to write about it at that intimate level was hard.
And was Grace a real character or somebody that
Yeah.
you made up?
The amazing thing about the real person Grace is that number 1, all that happened. She was raised with Sally. She was given as a wedding gift by the girl's father to Chang and Chang. She then ended up being emancipated and coming back to live with Sally for the rest of her life. With her, she had 9 children, but 3 of them lived.
Who
And with
may or
those,
may not have been Chang and Angs.
right.
Right. Well, the other thing I wanna talk about also is you are, the eldest of 4 girls, and I am the eldest of 4 girls, and one of the things that you do so expertly in this book as well is really talk about the push-pull of sister relationships. You see Sally and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the sister's name.
Adelaide.
Addie, Sally and Addie's relationship sort of go like this, right? Back and forth, and just as the way that all sisters do, right? You're close, you're too close, you're far away, you're angry, you're happy, you love them, you talk to them about your troubles, then you can't talk to them about your troubles. There's a real intensity to the sister bond here, made more intense by the fact that they have to be married to conjoined twins.
Right.
But what did your sisters think of this book? Have they read it yet?
They have read it. They've been lovely. I mean, honestly, so much of this I don't mean to say I didn't draw on all the sisterly bond, which I fully agree with you about and understand. Sarah and Adelaide, even though we don't have writings by them, the personalities as I described them in the book were very accurate.
Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah, mhm.
Adelaide was this dominant sister. And in fact, I did an event, as I said yesterday, with her great granddaughter, who had all these other stories about how dominant she was. She called her a battle axe in old age. She lived to be like in her mid-90s. She lived forever. And in that time period, it wasn't that usual. Sarah was not. And Sarah was also, as I describe her, kind of a dreamy, like her kids were messy. She was like, they were always playing in the mud and Adelaide was very, disciplined and everything was very neat and all of it. So those were true things. And that made it easier for me to kind of separate and describe this relationship in granular detail. But one of the scenes in the book that was the hardest to write that I didn't want to write was Sarah and Adelaide in my novel. Their their beliefs start to diverge about the war. And I don't know if that was true, but I do know that Sarah was buried separately on her own property away from her
Wow.
sister and her husband.
Very interesting tidbit there, yes.
And that she lived a mile from her sister for the rest of her life, but did not live with her. Instead, she lived with Grace and
Right.
Grace's boys. So that was very interesting. But Sarah and Adelaide in my novel, their beliefs sort of begin to diverge. And my editor said, "Look, you're having them say things about each other, and they're passive aggressive and whatever, but you actually have to have a scene of conflict between
Right.
them about this. You have to have them have this conversation." And I said I didn't want to do it because I was afraid that Sarah, who represents the contemporary perspective, really, I mean, who believes in slavery now and
Right.
chattel slavery, or at least who admits it, I guess we should say. Because, by the way, I do not think that human nature changes. I think that laws change.
I agree with you completely.
And I think that there are plenty of people alive today who would have been just fine
Super
if
happy, yes, that slavery continued, yeah.
so Sarah, I was afraid that it would just become, like, unfair to Adelaide, actually, and instead, I was sort of shocked to write my way into a place where Adelaide says all this really true stuff, which is like, "Bitch, you are complicit. I don't see you leaving. You benefit from the system. You're whining about it, but you're not doing anything about it. You're actually not even an activist in any way. You don't take a stand in any way. You just complain about it."
Right.
And it was all true. And I was able then to really understand how deeply insidious the system is and how deeply complicit Sarah was, even though she was torn. It's
Right.
all fine and good to wring your hands, right? And that's exactly what Adelaide said is like, "You're wringing your hands, but it doesn't mean a single thing."
Totally, and did they send their boys off to war? Did they send their boys off to
Oh,
the
yeah. All that was true. They both sent their oldest boys off to war. Both of them, one was, captured and they were both injured. And they thought they were both dead for a while because, it took a long time for news to come back,
yeah,
especially if they were taken prisoner, which they were. So they were very much involved in the war. Not only that, their area was part of the war. Stoneman marched through. He didn't burn houses in the town, but his very unruly band of marauders stole all this stuff. They molested one of the girls in the family. They were dangerous and scary. And Aang was conscripted. That scene that I wrote was
that
true.
was amazing that one of the twins is conscripted and the other one's not, and they're like, "Well, what do you want
Uh,
me to do?" All right, I
can't
have one
really.
more question that is burning question for me,
Yes.
which is, and I don't wanna give away the ending, so I'm gonna ask it in a weird way, but there was a scene at the beginning where we see that Sally gets pregnant, because she was molested by, a relative,
Traveling salesman, actually.
traveling salesman, and there's a scene with her mother at the end. Is that based on a true story? Where the mother talks
So
about
the crazy true story is that the mother was between 5 and 700 pounds in real life.
Wow.
And I learned yesterday in this event with Adelaide's descendant, Alex, that she was probably the largest woman in America.
So, like, the conjoined twins and the largest woman in America, and there you have the Guinness Book of World Records.
I honestly think that that is partly why the women had some tolerance to this difference.
Right,
They lived with such difference with
right.
their mother. So she was, as I describe in the book, not a great mother. She was depressed. She stayed in her room. She was housebound. She was agoraphobic. All of that is true. I just wanted to create an arc where maybe there was some kind of conversation eventually about why she was the way she was.
And by the way, it seemed totally plausible. Your
It
your
seemed
re your
plausible.
reasoning seems like a totally plausible reason for a woman to gain 500 pounds.
Yeah, it was just so, so unusual.
Yeah.
There were many unusual, quirky things. People are strange. The father was Quaker. That was very unusual.
Yeah,
Quakers are not supposed to be slave owners. He was a hypocrite too.
right.
All of this. And then finally about the stuff at the beginning, because the family, I think there are some family members who maybe are not happy about this, but um, I don't know if anything like that happened to Sarah. However, there was scandal in the family. Alston, their brother, was a total scoundrel, and he got a woman pregnant who was already married. There were like 3 different things that Alston did that were like, "Really?" I mean, he just was kind of like marauding around being
Could have trickled
nutty.
down to the girl's reputation, you're saying.
I think it did. I think
Yeah.
it did. Yeah.
Well,
So
I wanna tell you one last thing, which is that on my way here, I was at my other office today, and I was walking home to do this interview, and I called my sister, Jen, immediately, not the twins. So there's Jen and me, and then there's the identical twins, and I was like, "You have to read this book," and I started describing it to her, and I think I sold one for you. So
oh, thank
I
you.
I I love this book unabashedly. I am so glad you wrote it. Townsend's gonna read it next. Is there any last thing that I haven't asked you that you would like to talk about before we end our conversation?
Um, I would say if you have the opportunity to see me, on the road or this summer in Maine or in New York City, I have a slideshow that is so mind-blowing because I had access to the archives of UNC, and I have all these photographs and all of this stuff that people don't get when you can't read the book without Googling. I know when you read the book, you're like, what's going on?"
I didn't
But
Google
there's
until I got to the end, I have to tell you.
oh,
I
that
did the
that
whole
that's
thing without Google, and then I got to the end, and I listened to Mo Rocca, on his
yes,
podcast,
yes.
and I did, I Wikipedia'd. I did my own little Googling at the end, but I would love I mean, how are people supposed to see you? Do you have your
Yeah, so
schedule on
my tour
right?
is listed online in my website and on
Okay.
Instagram, but I would just say if you have a chance to see the slideshow that I do, it's actually it's a half hour and it's super interesting. Um, I have a short version that is, like a little video on my website, but anyway, so there's just so much to the story that's rich. It is a microcosm in my view of America and of America now even, like, as I was writing it, it felt so current. And I'll just end by saying Hilary Mantel once said that she believes she writes contemporary novels set in the past. And in
Right.
a way, that's what I feel like I did here is I wrote a contemporary novel set in the past because all of the stuff that I wrote about intimacy, prejudice, immigration is stuff we're grappling with as a nation at the moment. So,
100%, and I felt that same way about Orphan Train, that it was set in the past, but it was very, very contemporary in so many ways. Christina Baker Kline, thank you so much. I am going to hit end recording, and it's gonna send us off, but I will text you after this, okay?
all right,
Thank you so much.
fantastic. Thank you so much, Jen.